Okay, so I want to go over this particular medical release because it would be extremely beneficial to be able to do MRIs at a much lower cost. And one of the problems with that is these MRI machines, they can cost over $3 million and they need to output a very high amount of magnetic field. However, if we can get the same types of imaging with less magnetic field, then we can significantly reduce the costs. So with that, I'm going to jump into it. And what I also want to say is very frequently in MRI, we will inject contrasting agents or agents into some chemicals into the blood, and by injecting it into the blood, it ends up changing the magnetic properties of the blood so that it's easier to visualize on a screen. Now, with these weaker magnets, we would need more and more contrasting agent to get the same type of image out. But the problem with those contrasting agents is that the concentrations that would be necessary would be toxic if we want to do that same thing with a lower magnetic field. So rather than deal with the same type or the same class of contrasting agents, if there are a different class of contrasting agents that can work with these low magnetic fields, then we can really make this entire field a lot cheaper, a lot more affordable, and a lot more accessible for everyone. Anyways, with that, let's begin. So the study identifies missing piece needed for lower cost, high quality MRIs. So lowering the cost of magnetic resonance imaging could revolutionize how doctors diagnose and screen for many diseases. In a study published in the journal Science Advances, a researcher at Massachusetts General Hospital and colleagues in Australia identified the missing piece needed to generate this high-quality imaging using low-cost MRI scanners, which could expand its role of this powerful technology in medicine. So a typical MRI scanner carries a price tag of up to $3 million. So completely inaccessible for most people, most like general practitioners. Like if you have your own practice, you very most likely would not be able to come up with the startup capital to get this $3 million machine, and even if you did, you probably wouldn't even be able to use it enough in order to recuperate your costs, right? So very inaccessible, which is why machines are primarily found in imaging clinics and are typically unaffordable for hospitals in remote areas with small patient populations. So yeah, most hospitals probably can't afford these, and most doctors, if they have their own practices, would not be able to have a machine such as this, which sucks because then they have to ship off people or recommend them to go to a location that's probably hours away to go or undergo the imaging, which could basically make it more difficult to do diagnoses, make it more difficult to see how diseases are progressing or if there's a problem even in the first place. So yeah, finding a way to make MRI scanners more affordable has long been the objective of the physicist Matthew Rosen, who's a PhD and the director of the low field MRI and hyperpolarized media laboratory at MGH Martino Center for Biomedical Engineering. That's a mouthful right there. So the focus of my lab is to deconstruct the MRI, says Rosen. So the cost of an MRI scanner is largely driven by its superconducting magnets. So these are magnets that are usually made out of a coil, and usually they're charged with an electric current running through them, and they are superconducting. So basically, it is cooled to a very low temperature. This coil is cooled to a very low temperature, and then when it's in this low temperature, there's very little, what the word be? Well, there's high conductivity. Oh, there's very little resistance or zero resistance to electrical currents for normal. I shouldn't say normal, but for a certain range of different currents, you can have zero resistance. And so what happens is they bring these coils to very close to 0 Kelvin, or they bring it very cold, and then they will create a current in it. And since it's a coil, that current just keeps on going around and around, and then it loops in on itself. And so this coil, since the current is going through it indefinitely, this ends up causing a permanent or a semi-permanent magnetic field that goes through that coil. Okay, so that is the general breakdown of that. So the stronger the magnetic field it produces, the more expensive the machine is. So a typical MRI machine generates a magnetic field of 1.5 Teslas, though increasingly machines reach 3 Teslas. So Tesla is just of a measurement of the magnetic field strength at a location. So, however, a new generation of portable low-field MRI scanners that operate at 0.064 Tesla and cost between $50,000 and $100,000 has recently become available. So, $50,000 to $100,000. This is within the price range that many hospitals can afford. So, if we can, many hospitals and just people with their own practices would be able to come up with the starting capital to get these machines, and most likely would be able to recuperate the costs if they can function at a level that is comparable to these $3 million machines. Now, granted, they have, what would this be? So, it's pretty much about 1/50th of the, what would you call it? 1/50th of the field strength. So they're not nearly as strong as these, but if they are, 1/50th the price, then it's worth it, right? So yeah, is that 1/50th? About 1/50th. So while the low field MRIs are growing in popularity, the radiologists frequently ask Rosen if an injectable contrast agent is available to improve the images they produce. So doctors occasionally inject patients with a contrast agent based on the heavy metal gadolinium before performing a conventional MRI to enhance image quality. Though concerns about long-term health toxicity have now limit that particular practice. So, gadolinium, what is it? So here we have a periodic table, and here gadolinium is right here, and the reason why gadolinium is used is because, how do I phrase it? I probably need to go a little bit into what electron orbitals are. So electrons very frequently like to pair themselves up. And so these atoms in the periodic table, these elements, as they get bigger, they are opening new possibilities as to what shapes and what probability clouds these electrons can inhabit. So the first one is hydrogen, and as you can see here, we're talking about the 1s orbital, and don't worry too much about this, just know that this is a type of probability distribution that this electron can then occupy. And as you increase the number of protons, you increase the number of electrons. And so as you can see here, this 1s orbital now has this additional electron, but they're pointing in opposite directions. So what is happening is the electrons are basically occupying the same orbital, but they're occupying it in a way in that their magnetic moments will cancel each other out as they are going around the nucleus. So that is with the 1s orbital, and as the molecule becomes more and more complex, you end up filling more orbitals. And there are certain general rules of thumb of how the electrons end up moving into these different electron orbital probability spaces. Okay, so as you can see here, let's go here with nitrogen. With nitrogen, we are starting to fill up these 2p orbitals, is what they're called. And as the electrons are filling them up, they actually are filling one at a time before they end up doubling up. So as you go from nitrogen to oxygen, this additional electron that oxygen has over nitrogen is now pairing up with one of the first 2p electrons. And then this process will continue as we go higher and higher up into the periodic table, or technically lower in the periodic table with this view. You end up creating many, many more options. And so gadolinium over here has all of these electrons that are filling up the 4f orbital, but they are filling them up separately. So these are all separate unpaired electrons, and then they also have filled up this 5d orbital as well. So here we can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 unpaired electrons with normal gadolinium. So keep that in mind. This is the word be. It would be the single atom of gadolinium, and that's not how it is in an actual molecule, but for the sake of this argument, you can see that there are a lot of unpaired electrons in the normal gadolinium atom. So why is this important? So it's important in how we understand how MRIs work in general. So with an MRI, they are exerting a very strong magnetic field on the tissues that are within it, right? And what happens with this is that let me try to get up a little bit of the science. Okay, I don't think I can find a really nice image here on Wikipedia. But basically what happens is when you have this very strong magnetic field, a lot of the protons in your body will start to align with or against the magnetic field. So the reason for this is that within the nucleus of most hydrogens in your body, there is only one proton. And this one proton in of itself has a very small magnetic moment to it. So it's a little magnetic. And this proton is also normally just spinning in any which direction, and there's very little rhyme or reason to wherever that magnetic moment is pointing, unless you have a very strong magnetic field. It then convinces those protons to either align with the magnetic field or align against the magnetic field. Okay, but remember, there's still a lot of energy in that proton, right? So rather than lining up perfectly with it, it actually is processing around a particular, it's processing with or against that magnetic field. So it's not lining up perfectly, it's moving like a top is, so it's not going to be perfect. So what we do is, and I should say this is not just for the hydrogens that are in your body, technically all of the nuclei of the atoms in your body that have, I believe, an odd number of nucleons, so neutrons and protons, everyone with an odd number of them is going to have a little bit of this lining up with or against the magnetic field. Okay, so just know that that is happening when you have all the protons that have an odd number will be doing something of this sort. However, those require different energies, and we're not looking for those types of energies in the typical MRI scan. Okay, so going back, your hydrogens are processing either with or against the magnetic field. And then what we do is we take radiation, and we take radiation that is very good at interacting with those hydrogens, and then we give those hydrogens more and more energy, and that makes them process more and more. And what we try to do is get them so that they process so that they are actually perpendicular to the magnetic field. So by adding more and more energy, we basically made these protons do the opposite of what they really want to do, which is line up, right? So that is the first thing. And then after we stop the radiation, then all of those protons are then going to basically move more and more towards the magnetic field. And so these protons are slowly but surely lining up. And as they do that, they are releasing a signal. They're releasing the energy back into the environment, and then we can measure that energy, and from that measurement we can make these really nice images of what is going on inside your body. Okay? But what I forgot to mention, or what I need to explicitly say, is that how fast those protons will go back into alignment, this is going to be dependent on, one, the electrical structure around that hydrogen. And so depending on what molecules are bound to those hydrogen, depending on the environment that the hydrogen is floating around in, are there metals nearby? Are there amino acids nearby that are eliciting different effects? Are there, what would the word be? Yeah, basically all of the hydrogens in the body will have their own local environment, and that will affect the rate at which it goes back or lines back up with the magnetic field. And so this is how different parts of your body or different tissues in your body will have different colors on the image, right? So as they're relaxing in their different rates, or as they are going back to aligning with the magnetic field, they are going to do it in different rates, and those different rates will translate into different intensities or different colors on our image. Okay, so that's the general principle. So what are these contrasting agents for? Well, these contrasting agents will have a very effective, they have an effective mechanism at changing the magnetic field in whatever solution, how to phrase that? Everywhere where these contrasting agents are, they will locally affect the magnetic field strength. Okay, so if they strengthen the magnetic field in a certain area, then that could show up as a completely different color. And so this would be a good way to add contrast to one location or one type of material versus another. And so frequently it's used to boost up the contrast of the blood that is going inside of the brain or going inside of, whatever, right? So that is the general principle. So why is gadolinium used? Well, gadolinium in its ionic form still has a lot of these unpaired electrons, right? So here, all of these unpaired electrons will actually increase the magnetic field in the location. So how is it doing that? So basically, these electrons, when they are unpaired, as they are rotating around the nucleus, each one of them will exert its own magnetic field, right? So each electron that moves, circles, for lack of a better word, each electron that circles is going to generate a small magnetic moment. Okay? Now, generally, these magnetic moments, unless you are dealing with, say, paramagnetism, these magnetic moments are not going to line up, and you're not going to have a significant magnetic field generated from it. Okay? But when you have a very strong magnetic field nearby, that causes these unpaired electrons to line up their magnetic field with the strong magnetic field nearby. And what is the consequence of this? Well, the consequence is that all of those atoms will then behave like little magnets. And not only will they behave like little magnets, they are going to increase the intensity of the magnetic field. And so you can sort of see this. I don't know if it's that good of a mechanism, but good of a translation, but I'll use it anyway. So think of how sometimes you can have a piece of metal, piece of iron on the ground, and you can hold a magnet over it. And you can hold the magnet at a distance that it will not pick up that piece of metal, right? But let's say you take that magnet and then you take a nail or take another piece of metal, and this magnet will then magnetize the rest of the nail, at least momentarily. That magnetized nail, if you hold the magnet from the same distance, it is able to pick up the first piece of metal, because what is happening is the first magnet is magnetizing the second metal, and then the second metal basically increases the strength of that magnetic field and propagates it further, so then you can pick up a second piece of metal. That's the best way that I can describe it. And granted, that's using ferromagnetism, which is different. That is also dealing with unpaired electrons, but it's dealing with unpaired electrons that are naturally, based on the crystal structure of the iron, able to line up anyway without an external magnetic field. However, another magnet will actually help that process move along a little bit more. So just, this is why gadolinium is used explicitly. One, because it was generally considered non-toxic in the dosages that were being given to people, but then also since it has all these unpaired electrons, even after it's been turned into another, basically once it's in a chemical, it still retains a lot of this free unpaired electron, what would the word be, properties. So with that, I am going longer than I thought, but here we go. So they would normally do that, but when it comes to these really weak, comparatively MRI scanners, also known as the low field MRI scanners, you wouldn't be able to do this because you'd have to inject so much gadolinium into someone, you wouldn't be able, that would be toxic, or it would be considered toxic. I don't know if we've really done the experiment to, prove one way or the other. So, while these low field MRIs are growing in popularity, radiologists frequently ask Rosen if injectable contrast agents are available to improve the images they produce. And doctors occasionally inject patients with a contrast agent based on the heavy metal gadolinium. I already read this, but just so we're catching up. So, and they do this before a conventional MRI to enhance image quality. However, there's a little bit of a toxicity problem. So, for gadolinium to be used with low-field MRI, a doctor would have to administer 1,000 times more than the amount approved by the FDA. So, this makes it unobtainable, at least. So, to solve the problem, the physicist David Waddington, the lead author of the Science Advances study, and Zendeka Kunchik, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Oh, I know I'm mispronouncing your name, but I do not know how to pronounce it. So both from the University of Sydney, they suggested testing Superparamagnetic iron oxide nanoparticles, or SPION. So what is superparamagnetic? So paramagnetic is the property that I was talking to you about earlier. So paramagnetic is when your material or your chemical has these unpaired electrons. And these unpaired electrons each have their own individual magnetic moment, however they might be disordered. So it is a magnetism that is generated within the material when there is an external magnetic field present. So here paramagnetism is a form of magnetism whereby some materials are weakly attracted by an externally applied magnetic force and form internal induced magnetic field. So they are internal and they are induced. So once you remove the magnetic field, it is no longer there. And this would be in contrast to, say, ferromagnetism, which after you remove the magnetic field, the way that the crystal structure and the way that the electrons are sort of stuck in that material, you will still have a magnetic field even after you've removed the external magnetic field. So in contrast with this behavior, there is diamagnetic materials, which are repelled by magnetic fields and form induced magnetic fields in the direction opposite to that of the applied magnetic field. So paramagnetism is when oftentimes you have unpaired electrons, and this allows them to align with magnetic field. But you can also have diamagnetism, which is generally, technically, I believe, most materials that are neutral and have do have paired electrons, those will exhibit diamagnetic, or they will line up their magnetic moments against the external magnetic field. So I don't know if I should go too far. So paramagnetism is due to the presence of unpaired electrons in the material. So most atoms with incompletely filled atomic orbitals are paramagnetic, although exceptions such as copper exist. And due to their spin, unpaired electrons have a magnetic dipole moment and act like tiny magnets. So yeah, just this is what is happening. So some materials include aluminum, oxygen. So oxygen gas, especially when it is supercooled into a liquid, you can see this paramagnetic behavior. Titanium and iron oxide. So that is what normal paramagnetism is, but we're not talking about those. We're talking about superparamagnetic iron oxide. So basically paramagnetism on steroids. And so iron oxide, this is basically types of rust or oxygenated or burned iron. This would be an example, or how to phrase that. Basically, you can have these particles with iron oxide, and they can be in the right sizes where they have fine-tuned what properties they are looking for. And you have these iron particles that are in of themselves super paramagnetic. And so these particles are doing the same thing that gadolinium does. They have all of these unpaired electrons. that end up inducing a magnetic, or end up becoming very magnetic when there's an externally applied magnetic force. And so what they're doing is locally, in that local area, they are bumping up the magnetic field. And you could imagine that there could be a, what would the word be, a buildup effect, where one spion and another spion, if they're close to each other, they will influence each other and increase the magnetic field of each other. So it's not just one order of effects, there are multiple orders of effects when you have all these things together, right? So with this, just knowing this, we can now use these iron oxide nanoparticles that are superparamagnetic to take the place of gadolinium. So spions are safe and approved by the FDA for treating some cases of anemia or iron deficiency, but they have another desirable quality. The spions essentially amplify the low magnetic fields, noting that spions are, 3,000 times more magnetic than conventional MRI contrasting agents. So 3,000 times more powerful. That is phenomenal. So in this study, healthy lab rats were scanned with Rosen's homemade ultra-low field, or ULF, MRI, and remember what I should say. This is 0.0065 Tesla. This is ultra low field, or ULF. What we were talking about here with these low field MRI scanners, those are 0.064 Tesla. This is another order of magnitude weaker. So they did this other order of magnitude weaker magnet and then injected the spions, and then they rescanned. And then a comparison of the pre and post injection images showed a striking difference, with the kidneys, livers, and other organs glowing brightly following administration of spions. So while spions need to be approved by the FDA for use as a contrast agent, doctors can use them now off-label with low-field MRI. So Rosen and Waddington believe the combination of portable low-field MRIs and spions will bring this valuable imaging technology to emergency rooms, ICUs, and doctors' offices for routine screenings. Could you imagine the benefit to society if we are able to do MRI screenings as a part of your routine? That would be phenomenal, because there are a lot of problems that only after you show symptoms and the doctor, your doctor or your general practitioner believes that there is something serious enough to elicit an MRI, that is when you get an MRI. It's not a general thing. It's not something that, oh yeah, I'm not feeling well, maybe I should just get an MRI to figure out what's wrong. No, the MRI is really down the list as far as, at least for the general public. I have no idea how the super wealthy do it, but at least for the general public, getting an MRI is down the list as far as when you get it. So there's a lot of other, what would the word be, detective work that has to go in first. However, if you got the MRI, that probably would have solved most of your problems. But the problem is it's expensive, and it's very difficult to get one, right? So a huge benefit to society would be if we can make this cheap and affordable and in every doctor's office, then you could just do it as a general screening. And maybe you can find a brain aneurysm long before it bursts, right? And then you can tell your patient, hey, you need to watch your blood pressure, or you need to do these certain things, or we need to monitor this aneurysm to make sure it doesn't burst, right? So we're going to monitor it to make sure it doesn't grow, and hopefully it shrinks over time, things like that. So these people are investigating the use of specially coated spions, so spions with different chemicals on the surfaces that could allow MRI to be used for detecting malignant tumors. So for instance, you would be able to coat them with, say, different types of peptides or different types of antibodies or just chemicals that would specifically move these spions towards tumors, and that would be a way to give a tumor contrast in comparison to the surrounding material. And that would be excellent if you want to image, and then say if you needed to go in later to carefully remove or use radiation therapy to specifically attack a particular location. All that would be progressed, or there'd be a lot of progress in the field of medical sciences if these MRIs were affordable, right? So yeah, with that, I think I'm going to head out, but yeah, if you have any questions on any of this, please leave them down in the description below, and I am very excited to see what ends up happening with this. So y'all have a good one, and I'll see you soon.